So my name is Jarvis. I'm one of the pastors at the Journey Church, and Rachel Hennessey is here. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you.
I heard that you're speaking today. What's your topic on?
Well, we're going to talk about how to navigate our emotions and our relationships through this pandemic.
Well, thank you so much for coming today. I heard that you're a licensed counseling therapist,
Mhm.
14 years of experience. That means you're a professional. And we're so glad that you're here. And thank you for leading this mental health event.
So thank you for having me. It's a
Take it
privilege
away.
to help out at a time like this.
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to start by saying, we were created for connection, right? We were created for connection to God and connection to others. And so attachment is our fundamental need for survival. And we need to feel safe in the context of our caring relationships. And this pandemic has created all sorts of threats to our deepest need for connection. Right? We've been faced to some extent with our own mortality and that of our loved ones. And unfortunately, despite in New Brunswick, we're very fortunate, but we know in other parts of Canada and all over the world, many who have grieved the loss of a loved one or loved ones during this time. And so, we know people who are grieving and we've read their stories and it impacts us. And so this is hard. And we have to acknowledge that this is hard in so many ways, right? There's so much uncertainty and there's been so much change. And to think that even going to the grocery store, particularly a few weeks ago, we had to think about how much to clean our groceries, when we brought them in the door. And that's a level of stress that we are certainly not used to living with. And so this has created various challenges in so many ways. And we know that people are forced to grieve, without the common grieving rituals as well that we're used to having at times of loss. And so people are not able to come together as a community and support those who are grieving at this time. And so there are many impacts from this pandemic. We have forced separation from loved ones and from significant others. At the same time, we can have these feelings of isolation and loneliness, and then yet we can have this forced togetherness, as we went through our period of physical distancing and isolation. And so there's just all sorts of various combinations of people who have, now been living together. A lot of it's often immediate family members, but there's this forced isolation with forced togetherness. And, of course, various losses, loss of job, loss of income, vacation plans, loss of activities, loss of our daily routines, loss of dreams, to maybe walk across that stage at graduation, or to win that tournament. There's many different things that have been lost. And so there's a lot of grief. We have those things that we're grieving ourselves, but there's a sense of collective grief, as we're all grieving that life as we know it has changed and the world as we know it has changed. And unfortunately, too, we were faced with a horrific events in Halifax that unfolded. And oh, how we grieved and continue to grieve with those families. Those community. And so again, it's a particularly hard time for everyone, right? Especially for those who were already living with trauma. This only adds to it. And so with all of this comes so many emotions. How do we work through them? How do we navigate them? Right? And so first, I think it's really important to say, to acknowledge that we're in a state of alarm. What does this mean for us and for our emotions? It means this pandemic is a form of trauma, and I think we need to acknowledge that to varying degrees in each of us, but nonetheless a form of trauma. So essentially our bodies are in the middle of a stress response, and as a way of coping, and that's a way of coping that's meant to be adaptive, and our bodies release these stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol to help us deal with the alarm. When we perceive danger, we perceive threat, our bodies prepare us, the fight, flight freeze response. I'm sure everyone's heard of it. You know, if I'm walking through the woods and I meet a bear in the woods, right? Like my body releases adrenaline and cortisol into my extremities to literally help me run or fight or freeze, right? So we're gonna climb that tree, even though we'd never be able to climb it any other day. But with that stress response, we can climb that tree and whatever we need to do. And you know, so God has created our bodies in amazing ways, and in order to be adaptive, our brain and body reduces certain functions. You know, ironically, for one example, our immune system's capacities are reduced during a stress response, during the stress response. You know, so you know, the day before I go for a walk in the woods and meet the bear, if I'm exposed to a common cold virus and my immune system's doing what it's meant to do and it's kind of fighting that off, suddenly when I meet the bear, my brain reduces those capacities in the body that are taking away energy from that perceived threat. So there's different capacities that are reduced. But for our discussion today, it's important to note that our capacity to be aware of our emotions and to process our emotions is reduced. You know, and we can't fully process our emotions in this heightened state. And so it can be normal to feel numb and to feel disconnected from our emotions, especially, you know, if we've lived with trauma before. That can be even heightened more. So when we experience a lot of alarm, the stress response is activated, and though we are faced with a ton of emotion, it can be too much to work through directly. Our systems can be overloaded. So guess what? Our relationships are not immune to the impacts of COVID-19, right? People in this heightened state can often feel more anxious or more irritable or more easily agitated. We may be feeling like we're having a good day and until we stub our toe, and then suddenly we find ourselves having this heightened reaction that we wouldn't normally have, and suddenly we're really angry. You know, we have this angry outburst, or we're moved to tears, or we don't find our tears, but we find this deep sadness comes over us just from stubbing our toe, right? And so we can have these displaced emotions. We can have days where we might feel more blue. You know, relationally, this might include a tendency to withdraw. You know, just a general sense of being down, not specifically connecting to our emotions. This is normal right now because of the stress response and because the emotions are too much. It's too hard. And yet somehow we need to find a way through. We need to make room for them. You know, and so how do we do that? And we're going to talk about that in 3 different ways. We're going to talk about using our relationships to make room for our emotions, but also to help us feel connected as a way of coping. And we're going to talk about routines, and we're going to talk about release. And so how do we make room for emotions in our relationships with our partners or our children, our friends, right? So for instance, is there an adolescent in your life, right? You know, there are many that are grieving the loss of their graduation this year. You know, there are others that are grieving what their grad year could look like next year, right? There's so much uncertainty. We have to accept that at times we're going to see these displaced emotions, the stress they're living with. You know, it's going to play out in their behavior, in their tone, in their language, in their decisions. You know, as they face demands and challenges, we're going to see some of these emotions come out, and in indirect ways, just like the example of stubbing our toes, right? So, but we have to remember this serves a purpose. We don't want their emotions to get stuck with no outlet for release. So for instance, you know, if you find, and, you know, use this example too for spouses or for anyone we're in a relationship with, but, you know, if we're finding our kid is particularly grumpy or snappy with their siblings someday, you know, maybe we don't address that, right? Maybe we don't say, whoa, you know, don't use those harsh words, or can you soften, right? Instead of addressing it directly, we want to make room for the underlying emotions behind it. There may be things we need to address later, but in that moment, we want to say, you know, we might want to say, are you having a really hard day today? Is today harder than yesterday? Or, you know, whatever. We want to check in with them. Like, I noticed how you just spoke to your sister, and I know that's not how you like to speak to So what's happening today for you? And it's just kind of make room, right? Um, that can be hard to do when we're dealing with our own emotions, but we absolutely must make room. And if you need to come back later and address a certain behavior, you can come back later, but the hope would be as we make room for it, then that the adolescent could, or the person we're in a relationship with, could suddenly have that moment of release where they feel understood, or they feel that invitation to be, just to make room, right? They may or may not talk about them directly. Some personalities are going to talk about it. You might suddenly get several minutes of tears and talking, or explaining how they feel, or what's going on, or it might be something that they talk about less directly, but you've made room, right? And then if there's something you need to address, it will be accepted better, because you can say, oh, by the way, maybe tomorrow, try and later today, can you talk a little more gently with your sibling? She's actually going through what you're going through in a different way, right? But we want to make room, but we want to help our family members to make room too, for their own emotions, but others' emotions. So sometimes, right, they can talk about it directly, but often we have to make room for them in an indirect way, because it can feel like too much. And so let's talk about making room. So one of the ways we want to make room for our emotions is through our relationships. And I know that last example was kind of giving an example of how we can make room, but our relationships, like research shows us the incredible ability that connection with significant others can make. So even though there is stressors in life, and the stressors in life aren't diminished, but research has showed us that when there's that safe sense of connection, people are more resilient. Right? They're able to handle the stress because they don't feel alone. They feel that support. They feel that connection. And so, how do we use the relationships in our lives to feel connected? And, I know there's all kinds of like tangible, practical ways we can talk about, like through Zoom, right? I don't know, if people were part of a small group before, or maybe you haven't been for a little while. Try and get connected through the church. Call and see what small groups you can connect with via Zoom. Make sure you build intentional times of connection in your day, and your weeks. And so first is just be really intentional, right? You can say, oh, I really miss my sister, or I really been thinking about my neighbor down the street, wondering how they're doing. Right? Don't think about it. Be intentional. Make that phone call, because if you're thinking about them, that's going to feel good for them to know you've been thinking about them, and you're going to feel a sense of connection. Right? So, maybe pick certain people, like people that you miss the most. Make a list and get through it. You decide how much you get through it a day, but just you can be spontaneous, you can be flexible, but be intentional. Right? Those people you want to connect with. Maybe you were somebody who served people before through hospitality, or through, I was going to say food bank. I know food banks can still take volunteers now, but make sure you are serving people, because we know that's going to build you up. It's going to bring you joy. So be creative about ways you can serve people. And if you are needing ideas, I'm sure the church might be able to direct you. But you want to continue to connect with people in the ways you used to connect, but obviously with some various challenges and in a different way, but you still want to try and keep those connections. I was excited to hear that there are choir groups now meeting via Zoom, and so they're continuing with their choir practices via Zoom. And those things are so important. Right? You want to keep that sense of community you have had before. You want to continue. And the Journey's done a great job at transitioning to online and trying to create different opportunities for people. So yeah, be intentional, but also use language that builds a sense of anticipation, that builds a sense of attachment and connection. So you want to make plans ahead of time. And yes, you can still be spontaneous, but you want to make some plans of connection ahead of time. And you want to talk about them. So, for instance, like in your family, this is really important, right? You might say, you might get up and say, oh, I've got some things to do for work, but then I want to make sure I play a board game with my children. You know, then you want to make sure you check with them, right? Like, hey, what do you want to do? At the end of my workday today, I want to connect with you. Or what do you want to do on my lunch break, right? What can we do? Like, there's all sorts of various challenges with connection right now because, um, you know, kids aren't as busy in some ways, right? And we're sharing all this space. And yet you want to build in intentional times of connection and you want to talk about it ahead of time because that builds anticipation and that builds connection. So, maybe one of your children you do a daily walk with, right? And you say, I really love that we go on these walks. Really important to me. I love getting outside, but I love spending time. Right? And maybe there's a set time you go for a walk, or maybe you say, when are we going to go tomorrow? Right? Let's look at our schedules and pick a time for tomorrow. Right? It builds that sense of connection. It builds you're sort of creating a bridge to the next time you can have quality connection. So along with being intentional, right, we want to and in making those plans and talking about them ahead of time, there's all kinds of fun things you can do, right, that build connection. Maybe it's picking theme night suppers, right? Probably too much to do every day, but I know at our house we've done that a few times. We did 80s night. Our last one was 80s, and I know my youngest had to Google what 80s, what that would look like. And anyway, we dress up and then we vote for the winner, and she won because she had crimped hair, and she did it. She pulled it off. She was all 80s, and anyway, but have fun with that. And when you do that, right, it builds anticipation. And so some of the two youngest kind of brainstormed the ideas for theme night that builds anticipation. Then we pick one each week and do it, but do things like that, right? Create some fun. You want to have some family fun and you want to plan it ahead. So what do you do, right? How do you get the whole family on board? Get everybody picking different ideas, right? Let's just talk about if somebody has an adolescent that it's hard to connect with, right? Maybe they're really on their device and it's harder to get to them. Well, how do you make connection, right? You want to make connection. It's so important right now. Even if it seems they give you the vibes like they're okay and they don't need you. You want to be intentional. You want to make those connections. So maybe for that teen, it's finding out their favorite snack, and just intentionally bringing them some snacks, spontaneously through the day. Say, I was thinking of you. I wanted you to have your favorite snack. Right? I'm sure every teen boy wouldn't refuse. And look for that. Maybe you make that connection that way, right? They it's so important to make connection. And so don't be discouraged. Be creative that way. So now let's talk about routine. And some of this kind of overlaps, but I think it's really good. We know now there's a whole world of homeschooling parents now that didn't plan on it. When you're making routines with school, I just have to say it, right? Make sure the relationship stays the priority. Right? Outcomes are not the priority right now. It's making room for emotions. It's making connections in our relationships. There are routines that we're going to talk about that can help, but make sure relationship comes first over outcome. Now, it really is important to have routine for all of us at this point, adults and children. Children especially thrive on that consistency and that structure. and it creates a sense of safety for them. But I think all of us right now, in terms of making room for our emotions, can benefit highly from having routine, especially when our general normal routines are gone. That can help us cope. And so, you know, um, like I said, it can be some of those relationship things that you plan ahead. It can be it can be exercise. It can be some kind of structure to your day. So maybe there's tea time you have at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and maybe you book it ahead with a different friend each day, or maybe you have it with somebody in your home. But have those things that can be consistent, that you can look forward to, that create normalcy, right? So creating routines are important, and it also creates space for those emotions when you have those routines. Life feels less chaotic, and so then you're more able to make room for the emotions that also seem chaotic. Now, release is our final way to deal with emotions that we're going to talk about for today. And so, things in your life has been canceled, but things in your children's lives have been canceled. And a lot of them acted as a release, right? To help them work through this built up tension just in general life. And now when they need it most of all, it's not there. And so you want to have outlets in your life that help bring that release of emotion. Remember, we talked about that we can't always release them, talk about them directly. Sometimes it's too much. So you want to have outlets for them. I love this art exhibit right now that's going on at the Journey. What beautiful timing. There's no better time to have that than now. People are going through times that they connected to God through the teaching and the sermons, and now they're using art, all kinds of art. There's so much creativity out there, and they're using various art forms to show that. And so that helps them feel connected to God. But as they're creating these art pieces, they can have that form of release. And so beautiful. And so we want to look for things that help us have a sense of control in our lives. One of the dominant feelings I think many of us can relate to is a sense of powerlessness. I don't think it's, a coincidence that, flour and yeast have been sold out of the stores. There's so many people that have become avid bakers, and I'm sure having a sense of satisfaction at that, completing that project is exciting, but it's good. It's important, right? It's not so much about the outcome. You can make a loaf of bread and it doesn't even have to taste good, but it's that process of even making the bread can help us have a release of our emotions. It's that creativity. And it gives us a sense of control. And so, yeah, you want to find ways to release. For children, music is so important. But if we think about that tension they're carrying around because of this, getting out the drums, or if you don't have drums, making drums with pots and pans, like making music, playing songs they're familiar with, but even writing music, allowing them to take lead in what they want to say in their song. And maybe they even talk about COVID, right? It's a way that they can indirectly work through their emotions. And boy, that you'll be surprised if you bang in that pot with them, how good that might feel for you too, right? We so much need those forms of release. And so we might enjoy music, right? We might enjoy quiet music that's calming, right? We might enjoy connecting to God through worship music. And there's so many worship songs that can trigger our emotions in such beautiful ways, because we can feel that connection with God at the same time. We might also need, fast songs with an edge to try and get out that tension, right? And so, maybe to use all three ideas, the relationship, the routine, and the release, maybe at 2 o'clock every day, there's a same song or different songs that come on, just you blast it through the house and everyone dances to that one song, and you get it out, you get out some of that energy. We need that too. And maybe you followed up with a slow song or a worship song that just also helps bring that, but look for those opportunities. Know that we need that release, and make room for them, right? We need room for our sad feelings and our disappointments. There's so many disappointments, not being able to go to work, or not being able to, put on that prom dress, right? And there's so many losses to grieve. space. And so look for ways to release. And music is one of my favorite ways. And yeah. But movement is also really important, right? You want to make sure there's some kind of movement on a daily basis. Research shows us that how helpful movement is when someone's dealing with the impact of trauma. And we know with that stress response, we can often have that extra energy because of that adrenaline and cortisol in our bodies. So movement is so key. And, it can be simple like that dance or a walk, right? Or formal exercise. There's all kinds of direction online, all kinds of different exercise routines. But you want to make sure you have some kind of movement. That always helps bring relief. And I'm just going to say, as we close, I think it's also important when we think about relationships and we think about emotions and how they're hard to navigate, especially at this time. But I think we want to think about repair, right? We want to make sure we can own our mistakes. If we were harsh or we were irritable, we want to check in with the people we love, the people that were impacted, to see what that was like for them. We want to own it if we get it wrong, or we want to own the impact. Maybe we try and do something and we want to get it right and we get it wrong, and we just want to own the impact of that, right? And we can honor our good intentions, we can honor our kids' good intentions, but we want to make sure we make room for repair. We can teach an awful lot to our children through putting on Christ's humility and through grace for ourselves and for them. But we don't teach them through the illusion of perfection. And I'm thankful God doesn't call us to be perfect, but he does call us to be in relationship and to love well. And so I think part of loving well and getting through this time together is to repair when we hurt each other. Take time to say sorry, take time to own those impacts. So I hope, there's so much more we can talk about. It's a short amount of time, but first, just remember that this is trauma for individually and collectively, and we have to acknowledge that and make room for that and realize that then means there's a stress response that we're going through, and that has various impacts on our relationships and on our own well-being. And we want to make room for those feelings that are hard to make room for. And we can do that through our relationships and through creating routines in our life and through release, intentional outlets of release. And I hope that kind of gives people some ideas, and we can maybe chat more through the question.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for providing some tools of encouragement, some guidance to navigate through relationships and our emotions. So if anyone has any more questions, please send them to me on the text. Rachel, I have a few right now. I'll send them to you on the chat. And we'll take about 10 minutes for the Q&A. And if you can repeat the question and just take a minute or so for each one.
So am I baking more during this pandemic? Well, I'm cooking a lot, but not baking a lot, because baking is a challenge in our house with some food sensitivities. But I wouldn't say I'm baking more, but probably baking the same amount as I was before. What other good resources do you recommend for dealing with our emotions and our relationships? Kind of depends specifically, I guess, if you're looking for like marriage resources, or like, I know actually another idea I meant to mention is like Google conversation starters, right? Things like that keep the conversation going at home when sometimes there's not as much to talk about when our days are more mundane, but we want to really, again, have that connection. So conversation starters, there's all kinds of good ones online. You might want to Google that. If people want to reach out to me afterwards specifically for parenting or marriage resources, I can talk more about that. Some people will always focus on the 1-2 things that go wrong and miss the 98.8 that goes right. What is the best way to interact with these Yeah, well, they're needing some kind of validation, right? They're struggling. It's hard for them. They probably don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but that's where they are. And so I would look to validate, you know, um, that which is hard for them, and again, try and make room for their emotions. And also, um, you know, potentially you might have the opportunity to encourage them to practice gratitude. There's we know biblically how important this is to be joyful in all our circumstances, but practicing gratitude right now is really important. It can help us focus on the ways our lives are blessed, right? Because I think this is something we could all be more tempted to do right now, is focus on the negatives. One phrase I had read, um, a few weeks ago was, "It's not about staying home, but it's about staying safe." And so I love that, and I really picked up on that. Yeah, it's not, we're not home. We're safe at home. We're not stuck at home. We're safe at home, and I love that. And so, I think we need certain statements like that to remind us, even over the next few months, that will help us get through. And people want to connect with God and with Scripture, and but with others, to help them if they're finding they're being really negative. And unfortunately, any stress we had before this began, we still have those stressors, right? Most of those stressors are still there, and if we had tendencies towards negativity, then those are probably amplified as well right now. And so, you know we can use the challenges of this time to grow. And the greatest context for growth is always, unfortunately, a place of pain. And so, if you're struggling to be really negative, and we're kind of in this now for the long haul, we've got a few more months of uncertainty, reach out, because that isn't going to help you to be negative. You want to more than ever focus on the 98% that is good, and switch that around. Some people dismiss our emotions, but they're still very real. How are emotions tied with our reason? Oh, that's a big question. Um, the logical part of our brain is different than the part of our brain that processes emotion. And so yeah, no, our emotions are very important, and they're important ways for us to understand ourselves, right? And to I love one of my favorite chapters is Psalm 139, and for many reasons, but I love the verse that talks about, test and see if there's any anxious way in me. God is referred as the wonderful counselor, and he wants to know what's on our hearts, and he invites us to journey with him and dialogue with him about what that is. Sometimes we don't know, but God can show us, and God can help us understand our emotions and those things that are creating worries or anxiety. And so it's important. We need to have a relationship with our emotions. We need to have a self-awareness with them. We can't control our emotions if we don't have that self-awareness, right? And emotions are powerful, and they will control us, and they will impact our relationships. You know, the form of counseling I work with couples is emotionally based, and there's certain patterns of interaction that we develop in our relationships. And at time, every couple has a pattern of interaction, a cycle of interaction, and under times of distress, it shows up more, and it can become more ingrained, and it can keep them from feeling connected, right? But underneath those behaviors and those perceptions are emotions. And again, I'm just sharing that to show the impact of emotions. And we have to understand what they are. And so God, wants to take us on that journey and help us. And so, yeah, just obviously it's important. We need our logical part of our brain, but we also have to make room for our emotions. What are some practical ways to create indirect ways to make room for emotions? So I'm going to come back to number 5. How do children express stress? They don't come out and say, I'm stressed. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Stress comes, children, like, so the example of the teenager, right? And their tone, or whatever. Really want to understand with children, it can come out in all sorts of ways too, right? It can be just really restlessness, or Could be hard time getting to sleep. It can be aggression. And so, yeah, stress comes out in all sorts of ways. And, but with children, we want to, it's interesting if we are creating a sense of safety in their world and being age appropriate in how we describe things to them. A lot of children can feel less stress right now because they have more time with mom and dad if we can make quality time for young children, right? Yes, they can still feel the stress because some of their routines are gone, but ultimately, the most important thing for their development is to have a strong, safe relationship with their primary caregivers, their parents. And so it's amazing for kids how resilient they can be right now. So just again, to close, some practical ways to create indirect ways to make room for emotion. So yeah, so there's those just creative ways, like those outlets, that movement, music, different things like that. Everyone can be different. Like some people now, we have more opportunities to be in nature, and nature can be a very soothing place for people, where people feel more connected to God. Many, but yeah, it could be fishing, right? A man could process his emotions indirectly through fishing, right? We play as a way that children express emotions, and that's to expand on what I was talking about, homeschooling. It's more important that a child has quality time with their parents and lots of time for unstructured play than it is that they learn their math, that they get those math outcomes for the year. If they're making room for their emotions and their parents are making room for that and they're playing, play is meant to help children work through their emotions. And so if they're doing that, they're going to be in better shape for September than a child who doesn't have those outlets and doesn't have those relationships, but knows their math, right? So, because without those other components, children can't concentrate and learn anyway. So a child going back to school with those things, they'll be able to be more resilient and learn and more receptive. So just to describe that a little bit more.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for taking those questions. Are there any verbal questions like that people would like to ask? Well, if not, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing today and providing these resources for us. I appreciated how you said that words change our perspective, and that's one thing that I got from this. How can people know more about you and the work that you do, Rachel?
So they can find me online. I have the Couples Clinic and Family Therapy right here in Moncton. I'm currently right now doing online or phone counseling, but yeah, one of the passions I have is to help people strengthen their relationships that matter the most.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And next week, Tuesday at 7 o'clock, Brett Ullman will be here. And be sure to invite your friends. It's easier than ever to invite people to such events. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Rachel Hennessey, for sharing all these resources.